Today we're doing something that I love to do. Going to one of those relatively lesser known sites that I'm sure you've probably never heard of, and in fact even some relatively local people I met hadn't heard of it, and yet having a blast and learning a lot in the process. This was one of my most memorable archaeological visits and one of the more unexpected ones, and I hope after watching this video you'll want to add it to your itinerary as well. So buckle up, we're going to Kilmartin Glen in Scotland, where a terrific museum interprets the thousands of years of history you see right before your eyes. So let's get situated. This glen is about a 3-hour drive from Edinburgh and 2 hours from Glasgow, Scotland's two major cities. So yeah, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And it's in the county of Argyll, which just reminds me of the best terrible butchering of Scottish history film has ever produced.
Your uncle. Argyll.
Anyway, the point is that it may seem remote now, but thousands of years ago, it was at a key choke point for the movement of people. Think of it as a main rest stop on a superhighway. And around such a critical rest stop, an important cultural center grew up. But we'll talk more about that later. Let's dive right in.
Gone to 180, 34 years of age.
So this area is a glen, a narrow valley in the hilly landscape, and it is chock full of archaeology, all laid out in a compact but highly effective and informative museum. As soon as you enter, you get an overview of all the different kinds of monuments in the area, and all I can say is who knew? Argyll is such an archaeological theme park. Except this particular archaeological theme park probably looks a little more like this. Like many archaeological museums these days, this one starts with the more recent history and goes back in time to resemble how stratigraphy works. You start off hitting the newest archaeological layers and go back further and further in time as you dig. And if you want to know more about stratigraphy, catch my ABCs of Archaeology video about that topic. Anyway, I prefer a more straightforward approach where there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, so I did the museum in reverse, starting with the beginning. And that's where we begin, at the beginning, with one of the more bizarre archaeological features I've ever seen. Right at the north side of the glen, there is an odd wooden and earth feature. Picture this, a 400-meter or 1,300-foot long avenue of trees which had been deliberately cut down and placed in the ground standing upright in something like a horseshoe shape. Sitting on some earthworks, this formed a cist, an ancient Neolithic site with parallel banks and ditches. Believe it or not, Stonehenge sits next to one. But get this, the archaeological radiocarbon and tree ring data tell us that this thing didn't last too long. It was built and pretty quickly deliberately burnt down. Now, Britain is full of cursi, whatever the plural is, and I've been to many of them, but I've never seen one that was stuck full of trees and deliberately burnt. Obviously, like other of these guys, archaeologists impute a ritual function. Oof. I had been doing so well, but there's the R word, so you can take a drink. Now, you don't really get to see this site because first, it wasn't much to look at having been burnt down and all, but even so, it was quarried away after the archaeologists got a chance to study it, of course, as there were recently active quarries in the glen. But you can catch the area on your walk up to Carnassery Castle if you make it up that far. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How weird was this really? Because didn't Druids do all kinds of weird sacrificial sort of ceremonies that involve burning things all the time? Well, remember, we don't actually know that much about the Druids because they didn't write stuff down on purpose. Most of what we know about them comes from deliberately propagandistic Roman writers who were looking to throw shade their way. However, Druids are really a moot point because this site was long before the Druids, like further away from the Druids as the Druids are to us. You see, the Druids were Iron Age. This site is Neolithic. It dates back 5,650 to 5,800 years ago. That's like 3,000 years before there were any Druids. Now, moving on to what you actually can see in the flesh, the museum had some pretty cool artifacts. There are a lot of stone tools, and of course some of them are very old. like 10,000 years old. But from the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, we mean pottery. And if you recall in European prehistory, we tend to get to know people largely through their pottery, and hence cultures and whole periods of time are named after descriptions of the pottery. And here we have the bell beakers, folks we've talked about many times before. Quick refresher. A bit more than 5,000 years ago, a group of people called the Millennia started immigrating into Europe from the Pontic steppe. And they brought with them their own kinds of pottery styles, which when they mixed with local Neolithic populations, created those unique so-called bell beakers. A horrible name in my opinion, because when I think of a beaker, I think of this kind of stuff or this guy. Anyway, this is a bit of an oversimplification because the migrating peoples weren't monolithic, and the folks they mixed with also had their own local cultures, so there were plenty of subcultures within the bell beaker rubric. But this museum has some excellent pieces and some great examples of cultural evolution at work. And believe it or not, it's this humble little piece which is the showstopper in this department. You see, there are elements of this pot that reflect Irish traditions and others that reflect Yorkshire designs, showing that this place, Kilmartin Glen, was somewhere people traveled to and from. And in fact, pieces like this and other artifacts suggest that this valley was actually relatively well traveled, with people traveling from Ireland and further south down the coast to northeastern Scotland, particularly Orkney, which is another archaeological theme park that we'll be visiting shortly in another episode. Moreover, from the later part of this period, the early Bronze Age that is, we have the amazing burial of a diminutive young woman interred in a stone-lined grave called a cist, very near to where that burnt wooden feature was, only she came nearly 2,000 years later, or about 4,000 years ago. Based on analyses of her skeleton, we know she was in her 20s or early 30s when she died, and she had experienced instances of illness or malnutrition, and that might in part explain her small stature. And they were also able to do a facial reconstruction of her, which really brought the exhibit to life. And she does not look too happy. But then again, I guess I wouldn't be too happy either if I were dead. And this woman's grave came at the earlier part of what was a major building spree in the Glen, leaving the most visible monuments which you can still see today. And we have all sorts of other features. The stone circle dubbed Temple Wood was even older than the woman's grave at about 5,000 years old. On the other hand, the cairns and tumuli you see were built over thousands of years spanning from 3000 BC, so that's 5,000 years ago, to 1000 BC. These stone features are laid out all in a row running north-south along the Glen, making them an impressive procession way. And what's even cooler, these stone features were respected by populations both local and modern, who added their own burials and features and successively modified them. So you'll have a kiss grave placed within to or next to an earlier cairn or circle, and the artifacts found during the earlier excavations of these are on display in the museum. And these excavations were done largely, I believe, in the 1700s and 1800s, when the local family who owned the area was looking to do some landscaping. And it was that family who actually chose to preserve them for sort of status. Now, none of this would fly nowadays, where it's almost impossible to dig anywhere unless you have a need like there's going to be construction done. And here's some food for thought. How do we decide if it's better to leave stuff in the ground to preserve it or to dig it up and see what we can learn from it? Current archaeological orthodoxy is definitely with the former. You leave things in the ground unless you need to dig there, like for a construction project. However, I invite you to think about it. Where do you stand on this issue?
Talk amongst yourselves. I'll give you a topic.
Now, there are so many features and so much stuff, to be honest, it gets a little overwhelming until we get into the later Bronze Age and Iron Ages, which actually have a nice collection of artifacts not necessarily all found in graves. For me, one highlight was all the burnt seeds found in the vicinity, which aren't much to look at, but they tell us a lot about the climate and agricultural practices in each era. And from there, we move into the early Middle Ages, with a collection of stone Celtic crosses, but these were not Pictish as you find in much of Scotland, but rather from the kingdom of Dalriada, founded by a people from Ireland known by the Romans as the Scotti, who later came to dominate the land, giving the name to the country, Scotland. And there's some proper medieval stuff, but I could go on forever. So in my opinion, the best part of that collection is in the small church next door, where you can see a whole bunch of gravestones of medieval knights for which Scotland is known. But the real treat, what really makes this whole place special and brings the whole exhibit to life, is actually what lies outside the museum, which you can get a hint of just through the windows of the museum's very good cafe. The entire ceremonial landscape just laid out in front of you. The museum arranged a whole trail which takes you through the monuments you just read about. The cairns, the kists, the tumuli, the standing stones, the circles, the whole shebang. The main part of the walk is just a couple miles and it's in a valley, so it's flat, so it isn't that challenging. And it'll take you through some pretty scenery, and you'll definitely have friendly company along the way. Here, the signage by the monuments really brings it all together because, quite frankly, even for a dork like me, the museum got a little bit overwhelming in terms of the information, and it began to mush all together in my brain. And the signage will show you where each burial and the stuff in it was found, and some of those graves are even preserved. And the signage will show you how these features developed over time, because remember, people visited, respected, and altered these sites over thousands of years. For example, there were two stone circles next to each other which changed over time, with various features removed and added, such as kist graves and standing stones. And this really brings it to life. Recall those artistic renderings in the museum of what the site must have looked like back in the day? Well, when you stand there looking at the signage and looking at the actual feature, shit gets pretty real. And hence this relatively little-known site became one of the most rewarding archaeological experiences I've had anywhere. Bravo! Now, as I said, it's not really easy to get here unless you're really trying. I mean, maybe if you're heading back from Oban or Iona to Glasgow or Edinburgh, you'll pass through. But in any event, I think you should try because you will not be disappointed. And the entrance fee of £16 is pretty modest considering they just redesigned and reopened the place in September 2023, plus the grounds walk is free. And if you're into that sort of thing, it seems like a great place to do some historical cosplay, archaeology style. All right, that's it for this site visit, but let me know in the comments what you think, and look out for more videos from Scotland. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.